Julia Gillard there. For more on that speech, we're joined now from Sydney by Professor Geoffrey Garrett. He's the Chief Executive of the United States Studies Centre at the University of Sydney. Geoffrey Garrett, good morning and thanks for joining us.
It's my pleasure, Virginia.
It was interesting to remember this morning that just a few weeks ago when Julia Gillard spoke in New Zealand, you remember that phrase she used when she spoke to that parliament. This is the Asia-Pacific century and we are at its heart. She really took that message, particularly about China and about Australia's relationship with China, to the US Congress, didn't she?
Yeah, she did, and I actually think that's just building on some momentum from the past several months when Hillary Clinton was in Australia last November. That's what she talked about, Australian-American cooperation in an Asia-Pacific century. At exactly the same time, Barack Obama was on a big tour of Asia when he was talking about that. A lot of other countries are mentioned, but at the end of the day, I think China, obviously, China's rise looms largest.
What did you make of her speech?
I thought it was quite a predictable speech in terms of policy content. Maybe the emotiveness of it would have surprised some people, both from the Prime Minister when she teared up remembering Apollo 11 and also from John Boehner, the American Speaker of the House of Representatives. But I think what that underscores is that the old cliche is true, that the shared values, interests and history between Australia and the US and between Australians and Americans runs really deep.
Yeah, there is great truth in emotion, and I have to say I was most taken aback to see Speaker Boehner tear up in that way. But that history that you speak of, particularly that wartime history, and men, mostly men, sometimes women, you know, fighting side by side or in war circumstances and dying near each other, you can never underestimate the strength of that connection, can you?
No, you can't, and you know, this was a celebration of the 60th anniversary of the military alliance between Australia and the US, fighting side by side in every major conflict since World War II. But I think looking forward, what that means is that the bedrock of shared values, interests between the two countries provides a fantastic platform to deal with the very different challenges of the 21st century. A rise of emerging Asia, globalization, the fact that there's a blurring between domestic and international policy issues. Those are all big changes, obviously certainly very different from conditions in the early 1950s, but Australia and the US are positioned as an alliance, I think, to tackle them very effectively.
When I listened to what Julia Gillard had to say about China in the US Congress overnight, and when I read comments by the US Senator John McCain warning that Australia and the US have to work together in order to counter the rise of China as a military power, is it correct of me to conclude that Australia is, even being closer to China, a little more relaxed about the rise of China than America is at the moment?
I actually think there are enormous similarities between the American and Australian positions. So you begin with the observation that the economic rise of China is a plus, not only for Australia but for the US. That's an easier sell in Australia than it is in America. The second point, I think, for both sides, for both Australia and the US, is they want China to become a responsible global stakeholder. And then the third one that you don't emphasize is that at the same time, of course, both countries have to ensure against the small probability risk that China's rise becomes malevolent. And in that context, I wasn't surprised at all that Julia Gillard mentioned Australia, Korea and Japan as the foundations of America's Asia strategy. Of course, those three countries are all capitalist democracies.
And you weren't, of course, surprised by John McCain's comments either?
No, John McCain, when he was running for president, talked about creating a League of Democracies in the Asia-Pacific. At the time, I think he was poo-pooed a little bit for saying that. But in 2010, an interesting thing happened. I think the general perception is that China overplayed its hand a little bit and that countries in the Asia-Pacific looked to the US to re-engage, and the way the US has re-engaged is talking up values and interests, not only with Australia, Japan and Korea, but also with new friends like India and Indonesia.
Let me be a little bit greedy and a bit grasping for a moment, just looking at this visit coldly and the very warm reception that Julia Gillard got. What's in it for us? What can Australia expect from this, if anything?
Well, you know, the Australia-US alliance obviously is a political military one at its heart, with security guarantees for Australia. But I think the Prime Minister was right to talk about win-win economic outcomes. You know, the free trade agreement between the US and Australia is now 5 years old. One untold story often about that is that investment between Australia and the US is booming. I think it was also not surprising that the Prime Minister talked about energy and climate, but did so not talking about a carbon tax, but rather about moving to a green tech economy with lots of green tech jobs. I would expect that collaboration between Australia and the US on that will be very strong, even if we don't have either an American cap and trade scheme or something at the global level. It's an investment story, a positive story about moving to a clean energy economy.
Geoffrey Garrett, always good to talk to you. Thanks so much.
My pleasure, Virginia, as always.